My name is Alison O'Connor. I am the daughter of Jan Stoven, who I think many of you know. I am the horticulture agent for CSU Extension in Larimer County. So I'm actually in Fort Collins, Colorado. That's where I am currently located. We just got doused with a whole bunch of snow over the weekend, and I have to say it was the heaviest, wettest snow I have ever shoveled. So it was a beast. It's melting now, which is great, but we still have multiple inches on the ground. So we're not seeing our spring blooming bulbs like daffodils quite yet. In my job, I love what I do. I get to coordinate the Master Gardener program, and I get to do these amazing presentations for groups just like yours. So full disclaimer, I am in Colorado. I am not in Oregon. And so I would always encourage you to contact your local extension office with any questions that you might have, or talk to your local Yamhill County Master Gardeners. They are a great resource. It's all research-based, and it's really wonderful. I do want to thank our two sponsors for this event, and I just saw Patty come on. So we have Patty with the McMinnville Garden Club. We also have Jan with Seroptimist International, and then of course my mom, have to give her a shout out. Patty and Jan, would you like to say anything before we get started?
I would just like to thank you very much for being with us and doing this. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan.
Got the button. Yeah, thanks for joining all of us on my important day as Patricia with a son named Colin Patrick and a grandson named Patrick. It's a perfect day in the world today. I'm learning about dahlias and enjoying my Irish heritage. So thank you so much, Alison, for doing this again. I look forward to finding out more tips about how to be more successful with my bulbs.
That's great. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Jan. And Mom, I don't know if you want to come on. You're welcome. Otherwise, you can always just use the chat. And that's how we're going to communicate today. So everyone else has been muted. They have their cameras off, and then you can use the chat. So if you are able to find that, it's either at the bottom or the top of your screen. You can pull up the chat feature. I know a lot of you have already found it and were commenting on the music. So do use that if you have any questions as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started on summer blooming bulbs. I love this topic. It's so much fun. I do want to make one disclaimer that if I say spring planted, what that means is that you're planting those bulbs in the spring, but that they're going to bloom in the summer. So I might use those two phrases interchangeably. So just know if I say spring planted, it means everything we're talking about today. This is different than our fall planted bulbs like our daffodils and our crocus, which we plant in the fall and bloom in the spring. So a little bit about bulb biology. These are plants that have underground food storage organs. So if you are planning to have potatoes later today, like I am with my corned beef, that is a type of tuber, and we generally just call them bulbs. So tubers, corms, rhizomes, all of those are underground storage organs, and the plant has everything it needs then in order to bloom. So what we'll talk about today, the lilies, the dahlias, the cannas, they all have different storage organs. I'll call them bulbs in general, but just know that they do differ biologically. In general, these are plants that are either dug up in the fall, and we'll talk about that based on your climate in Oregon, and then you replant them each spring. So sometimes people treat them as annuals. They're a little bit of an expensive annual, which means that you just grow them for that one season. A lot of these plants, though, that we'll talk about today are actually going to be more perennial in your gardens in Oregon, just because you have a mild climate. Should you move to a different part of the United States or come to Colorado, just know that a lot of these bulbs are not going to survive really cold winters. So that is a difference there. What's amazing about these plants is they're incredibly tropical. They have so many colors, and they can really add a splash of fancy to your summer garden. These are some of the plants that you may consider using, and maybe you have planted a lot of these already. So tuberous begonias, gladiolus, they have a soft spot in my heart. I'll tell you about that. Our cannas, which are great in ponds. They're also great in containers. Dahlias, crocosmia, And then of course we have our group of lilies. So these are all considered summer blooming bulbs. And again, you would generally plant them in the spring if they're not hardy and overwintering in Oregon. When you go to purchase, so you guys are in the land of everything amazing because you have a lot of bulb growers. You have an amazing resource in Swan Island dahlias just in Oregon. And if you haven't been there, do visit this summer. They usually have some festivals starting in August, and it's an incredible place to visit. I've been there a couple of times. So you can order absolutely from online catalogs or other resources. I will point you to one resource later with Brent and Becky's bulbs, because if you purchase from them, you can actually benefit your fellow Soroptimists in McMinnville. I actually did that last fall when I bought some bulbs from Brent and Becky's. They're buried under snow, but they're there somewhere. And just know that when you do order online, the earlier you order, the better selection you will have. So I looked at Swan Island just a couple weeks ago, and a lot of their bulbs and tubers were already sold out. So just know that as soon as you get that catalog or you think of it, do place your order so that you can have the best selection. You can also buy these locally. That's absolutely a possibility. So a number of your garden centers, you can even find some at Lowe's or other hardware stores. You can buy them. At garden centers, you'll probably be able to buy them individually. Generally at Lowe's or other box stores, they'll be in a group of plants or in a bagged product. So again, earlier you go, the better. You can have the better selection. If you wait a little bit too long, you're looking at maybe potentially mushy situations, which is never good. So just know these are available now. You could start planting very soon because your climate is so much further ahead and you don't have 14 inches of snow on the ground. So again, when you're picking up your bulbs, avoid anything that's mushy, discolored, that might be rotting. And the general rule of thumb, just like your fall planted bulbs, is the bigger the bulb, the better the bloom will be. So that is a good thing. So if you are able to pick out things individually, if you're able to select your tubers or your corms, make sure they're free of any sort of disease or soft spots, and then compare them relatively to the size of the rest of them in the bin and pick the biggest ones because you'll have the most blooms, which is always a good thing. When you're looking at where to plant these in your garden, it's really going to depend. First of all, if you have any areas that are really soggy or too saturated, or you might be planting underneath a downspout, for example, those are areas that you want to avoid. For the most part, these bulbs are going to need full sun and well-drained soil. If you do plant them in full sun, let's say a west or a south-facing landscape, sometimes, and this is really important if you're going to enter your local county fair or any sort of flower shows, the darker colors like the reds, and especially the foliage, they might fade a little bit. So this is a big thing. My husband's grandma, Pat, lives in Ohio, and she was part of the Dahlia Society for most of her life. And so her garden was actually covered in umbrellas because she was an avid enterer of her county fair and local flower shows. And so she wanted to protect those reds from that full exposed sun. So just keep that in mind. It's not a big deal if you're just growing them for yourself or sharing with friends, but do know that full sun can actually fade some of those intense colors in the bulb. So the soil does need to be well drained. It should be relatively moist for you guys. Well, in the summer, you do have some drier periods, but of course, right now, you are getting some of your spring rains. But just know that consistently moist, well-drained soil is key. If you have, again, a soggy area or any sort of areas with compacted soils, I would avoid planting these in those spots. You can also then consider adding some supplemental fertilizer at planting. For the first year, at least, these bulbs will have everything they need to grow. If you do keep them year after year, adding a little bit of fertilizer is going to be a good idea. And so you can mix in whatever you want, your favorite type. It can be organic, it can be synthetic, granular, whatever it is, you can add that in. Do add it according to the directions on the label. Don't over amend, don't over fertilize, and just make sure that you're applying it accordingly. You can even do a half rate if that's something you want to consider. So essentially you will dig your hole, you can mix in some fertilizer, and then you would plant your bulbs with the fertilizer in there. One thing to consider is that if you do want plants with longer bloom, you can actually succession sow some of these plants like gladiolus. So just like you succession sow your green beans so that you have beans for a longer period of time, you can do the same thing with other plants. If you plant all of your gladiolas at once, you will have an amazing bloom sequence for a couple weeks. If you space those out and maybe plant them in April, maybe again 2 weeks later, and again 2 weeks later, you're going to stretch out the sequence of blooms and have cut flowers or that show in your garden for a longer period of time, which is always really nice. And this is especially important if you are trying to grow for cut flower bouquets or to add anything into your home. If you just want to enjoy them in the garden, absolutely plant them all at once, and just know that you're going to have a fairly shortened bloom time on some of those plants. But that is a way to kind of stretch out the gardening season to get a little bit more from these plants. And again, you just do it every couple weeks to extend that bloom period. Containers are totally possible with all of these plants. I garden almost exclusively in containers. I have some landscape plantings, but when I'm using these plants, I really do like to use them in containers because it adds so much to the patio or the deck. So you can definitely plant these into containers. If you do, make sure, this is number one, make sure your container is big enough to support the plant when it's fully grown. So for any of you who've grown big dahlias or even cannas, you know how large they can get by the end of the summer. So make sure that your container is wide enough and deep enough to support it. In general, you're going to need a container that's at least 12 inches wide and 12 inches deep. And for the most part, unlike this photo, you'll probably put just one tuber or bulb per container because, again, they can be very large plants. Depending on the plant, you may need to stake. So for some of the cannas, if it's in a windy spot, you might want to add some staking. Same thing for dahlias. And I would keep them out of where they get direct winds. I don't think wind is as big of an issue for you in Oregon as it is here in Colorado. But if you are in one of those force line winds that can cause some tatter, do keep it out of there because it can really shred some of those leaves of your bigger plants. And unlike in the ground, fertilizer will be absolutely important for containers. You are adding a lot more water to these plants, and so every time you water, you're leaching some of those valuable nutrients. And so in order to keep these plants growing and producing for the season, you will need to add supplemental fertilizer for your containerized plants. But don't start fertilizing until you start to see growth. Before that, it's really not necessary. So when should you plant? This is the big thing. It's going to depend on your location and what kind of spring that you're having. Clearly, we are not having a spring yet. For you, I know that a lot of your daffodils and other fall-planted bulbs are already blooming, so you're getting really, really close and you may have already planted. What you do want to wait for is for the soils to warm up some and then also dry down. And the way you can do this is you can actually measure your soil temperature. It sounds kind of nerdy, but it's pretty fun. All you have to do is find an exposed patch of soil, measure the soil temperature about 2 inches down. Ideally, your soil should probably be in the upper 40s into the 50s. Too cold of soils, oftentimes the plants will just sit there and then that can lead to rot. So do make sure that, again, you have kind of gotten out of those heavy spring rains, and then any sort of wet soil is going to warm up much more slowly. So that also behooves your plants because you're going to plant them in full sun. So warmer parts of the soil are going to warm up more quickly. But again, try to aim for at least 50 degrees soil temperature and see where you're at. Growth will generally start when the soils reach about 60 degrees. And as those soils start to warm, as we get warmer spring days, the soils do warm up more quickly than you might expect. But just know that you might get some root growth when the soils are a little bit colder, but you won't see any top growth until the soils get to be about 60 degrees. So again, really the death of a bulb is going to be cold, wet soils. That will lead to rot, that can lead to plant failure. So do approach that with a little bit of leniency going forward. So what should you plant? These are the ones that we will focus on. Right there is Maple the Beagle. And she is my little beagle. That was when we first adopted her. She's not quite as skinny anymore, but she was curious about everything. And so she was helping me plant some dahlias one year. Oh, and Mom asked, is there a tool to take soil temperature? Actually, you can use a thermometer. There are soil thermometers that you can buy. But if you just have a thermometer, even probably not a kitchen thermometer, it has to reach those temperatures. So a meat thermometer or something like that probably wouldn't get that cold. But anywhere you can find a thermometer to just measure those temperatures, you can do that. Or you can get one on Amazon. They're not overly expensive. It's also a great tool if you're planting vegetables to know what soil temperatures you do have. So let's start with dahlias, which is the one behind me. These are kind of the darling of the summer. And dahlias are just, to me, they're absolutely magical. I think they're amazing plants. There's so many different shapes and sizes. And there really is a dahlia that fits every landscape, which is great. So really diverse flower color. Again, they can be small plants for just, 18 to 24 inches tall, up to 6 feet tall. And these are plants that absolutely make a statement. They are wonderful cut flowers, and they do usually need staking unless you are planting some of the border type dahlias, the shorter ones. What you'll do is when you get your tubers in the mail or when you purchase them, generally the name is going to be stamped on the side of the tuber, so you know what you're planting because all the tubers look the same. You will plant the tubers on their side about 4 to 6 inches deep. And so in this case, this was more of a row crop, and so they were growing these for cut flowers. And so they dug a trench, plant them about 4 to 6 inches deep, and then you space them according to their size. So 36 inches apart if they're going to be really large, and then 16 to 24 if they're a smaller size dahlia. And the dahlia growers do say it is much easier to stake at planting than try to stake after they've started growing. And staking can be any sort of materials. It can be a simple bamboo rod. You can actually use tomato cages. That's a great thing. But staking will be needed for those larger varieties. Yeah, and that's exactly what Patty just said is tomato cages are perfect. So buy those tomato cages and use those for your dahlias. So a couple staking options. I like this one. Obviously, this is an experienced dahlia grower. This is a hardcore individual. I love this. But you can see how the plants are spaced, and then they're just using a simple staking mechanism, which then they can attach their fancy umbrellas to protect those flowers. Because obviously, this is someone who is entering these flowers into shows, which are really a lot of fun. So that could be the next venture for you as you go into 2021 and beyond. When you are getting growth on dahlias, it is recommended, especially if you want blooms. If you want large blooms, you're going to have to essentially remove the other flowers. And so this is called disbudding. And so really what you're doing is leaving the main center bloom and then removing the 2 side blooms. Now, it is not bad, it is not wrong if you do not do this. It depends on the type of grower you are. But just know that when you disbud, you are putting then the resources into that central bud, which is going to result in a much larger flower and less competition. So it is a good thing to do, again, if you're growing for the quality and the quantity in terms of size of the flower. If you do want to plant dahlias in containers, this is entirely possible. I have done this and it's very successful. Again, the container needs to be quite large, about 12 by 12, and you would do just 1 tuber per container. So unfortunately, for a long time, the container is not very interesting. You have this pot, you have some media in it, you'll get a little bit of growth, but it's not for several months until you start getting flowers that the container actually starts to look interesting. So just keep that in mind, that the tubers need to form roots and then they need to send up shoots, which then of course encourage the growth of flowers. But the planting process is the same. Plant your tubers on their side 4 to 6 inches deep, cover with your potting mix, and then do watch the water, especially as the plant is just getting established, because it's very easy to overwater and maybe potentially cause some rot with your bulbs. Betty tuned in that she's had success with planting in stock tanks. That is a great idea, Betty. So that's just a really, really big container. And with dahlias and anything, you only need about 12 inches of potting media depth. And so a stock tank is obviously much larger than that. So you can have stuff at the bottom to take up space. But as long as you have 12 inches of rooting depth, that should be plenty. So let's just run through the types of dahlias that you might want to purchase. And again, there are so many different ones that you can grow based on what you like. So the dinner plate dahlias are huge, 8 inches or larger. This is Otto's Thrill. This is a beautiful cut flower. My best friend Emily runs a small floral design business in Missouri, and dahlias are one of her ultimate flowers that she uses in her summer wedding arrangements. And so this is a bang for your buck for a vase. A single dahlia would be all you need. The decorative dahlias, as they're known, are much smaller. They're about 4 to 8 inches wide. This is white Onesta. It's a beautiful flower, really a nice white. And again, just decide what you like to grow. I know that Swan Island, if you do buy from them, kind of has a like an assortment. So you could just purchase the cut flower dahlias, or maybe you want ones that are more of shades of red and orange. They really do help you with mixes if you're not sure about varieties. But the decorative dahlias are just a little bit smaller. There's a cactus and semi-cactus variety. This is Karma Corona that's featured there. The petals on the cactus and semi-cactus are more spiky looking, and they can be full or partially rolled. So it really does add a different look. So just be aware that there are some different options. My favorites are the ball and the pom-pom. I just think these are so cute, and they tend to be a little bit shorter as well as plants. So 3 to 4 inches across. The petals are incredibly tightly compressed to the plant, and they really do look like a ball. I just find them to be so cute. There's a huge variety of them. They last really well as a cut flower, and they're great because they would really add an accent flower to some of your arrangements as well. You can grow dahlias that are the water lily type. These are the ones that you would cut almost right next to the base of the flower and then float them in a dish. This is really striking if you're having a dinner party, if we're going to have dinner parties again, or you just want to make a statement. At our fair in Larimer County, we do have several entries for the water lily types. And the idea with these is that the petals are actually slightly reflexed, and so they float on top of that water. They do last a very long time, and they're absolutely beautiful. This bicolor type is Priceless Pink, and that's a beautiful water lily type. There are also single dahlias, and so if you are a fan of pollinators and trying to encourage pollinators in your garden, these are easier for pollinators to get into. Let me go back one slide and explain this. So obviously for pollinators to get into this flower, it would be much more difficult than having just a few petals with all of the anthers and stigmas exposed with a single type. We did notice that last year in our trial gardens on campus at Colorado State, is that some of the single type dahlias had more pollinators just because it was easier access. So dahlias can be a wonderful pollinator plant. Just make sure that you're selecting those appropriately. HS Flame is what's featured, and HS just stands for happy single flame. Really a nice plant. There are all sorts of different types. And what's nice too about dahlias, and I didn't mention this, the foliage can really be complementary. So on this happy single dahlia, it's more of a burgundy, almost a chocolate colored foliage, and that really then makes that red pop. So all of these, again, are described in your catalogs, and no matter where you buy them, you can do some good searching for what you want. So I do see that there's a message from Patty, and she just said, my small dahlias tend to droop over due to the thin stalks. What is the solution? That could be, Patty, it might be a light issue. It could be that for some reason, that's a tough question. Let me think about that and I might come back to it. But I'm guessing it's more cultural than anything else. Could be water. I'm just trying to think of why the stalks would be so thin and and just cause them to collapse. It could be that you maybe are planting a little bit too deeply too. So that could be something, maybe raise up the planting height slightly. But I'll come back to that if I think of other reasons why that might be happening. Let's move on to cannas. I think cannas are just amazing. And truthfully, I like to grow cannas just for the foliage and not really the flowers. The flowers are nice. They're there. They're very tropical looking. But that foliage on the cannas is absolutely beautiful. Just look at those shades of variegation. And this really is a statement plant in the landscape. So if you do have a pond, cannas are a perfect candidate to put in your pond. They're also great for containers and then can also be done in the landscape as well. These are a rhizome, so a little bit similar to an iris, if you can envision what an iris root looks like. And you would plant these rhizomes about 6 inches deep and then 18 inches apart. These can be very, very large plants, especially at the end of the season when they're in full flower. If you do plant in containers, it should be about the same shape and size as the dahlias, so at least 12 by 12. And I would say only one rhizome per container. Now you could add some supplemental plants to that container, but do make sure that whatever you're planting has plenty of space to grow. If it's too large, not only can it have the potential to tip over, but then you also have to water about 5 times a day because it's drying out because there's so much root competition happening in a smaller container. The one thing about cannas is that they can get tattered by wind, so I would recommend you keep them in a place that's not too windy. There are many canna cultivars. You don't need to write this down. I should say that I will send these handouts to both Patty and Jan to make sure that they can send it out to the list. It's also being recorded, so you will also get the recording of the presentation if you need to review any information. So don't feel like you need to write anything down. Just know that there's a lot of different cultivars that you could consider depending on the foliage that you like. The burgundy and bronze foliage are some of my absolute favorites. It's really dark and it looks beautiful paired with either like a bright red flower or something white. So you get that kind of black and white look. It looks amazing. So here's a couple that you could consider. So there is Black Knight. Again, that's that really dark. It is variegated, so it's kind of streaks of almost, again, like that chocolate brown with some forest green, and then it has a bright red carmine flower, so really pops in the landscape. And then Cleopatra, how could you not love that? It's just absolutely incredible. And again, consider growing these just for the foliage. The flower is nice. The flower doesn't last as long, but that foliage will be present all summer. Moving on to lilies. Lilies are a common garden plant and they really are outstanding. If you haven't grown any lilies, do consider doing that. Of course, daylilies are in the Liliaceae genus, but they are not considered to be a true lily. They're a hemerocallis, but these are Lilium genus, so these are all true lilies. The flowers on lilies are very showy. We're getting into the season where you're going to start to see Easter lilies on display at some of the garden centers and grocery stores, and of course that's a common plant. Lilies are toxic to cats, and so if you have a cat in your neighborhood or you have your cat outside and they nibble, they can be very, very toxic. So just be aware of that fact. The flowers, again, are showy. They're very, very colorful, and they may nod down or up. They may look out. And so there's actually a lot of character to these flowers, and in a wide variety of colors. Lilies come as a bulb, so similar to a tulip, if you've ever planted tulips in the fall, and they do need full sun. So they are great plants for containers. What's nice for you in Oregon is that you can actually plant lilies in the fall, in October, and then you can plant them through the spring as well. So again, making sure that you can plant when the soils are workable, making sure that you plant when the soils aren't too wet, but just know that you can do a fall plant with lilies and they'll bloom a little bit sooner than if you plant them in the spring this time of year. If you use containers, I would plant those in the spring. Plant your bulbs 3 to 7 or about 8 to 12 inches apart if you're able. Obviously, this photograph has them a little bit closer together. We can kind of tweak things when we're in a container versus in the landscape, but keep them about a foot apart in the landscape, and then group your lilies together. So this is where you really do need more than one plant to make a nice show. So consider grouping in odd numbers. That's the general recommendation for a lot of landscape design. So in groups of 3, 5, 7, and then you can space those groupings a couple feet apart, and that will give you the most impact, which is really nice. The types of lilies that you might run into are Oriental, Asiatic, or the Turk's cap. Let's talk about each of those. The Asiatic lilies are probably the easiest ones to grow. They're really not picky at all. They just need full sun. They don't care too much about soil type, although well-drained soils is important. And what's really nice is that they don't need staking, and they're the first to bloom of the lilies. They have a wide range of colors. You can see here that we have this kind of speckled throat down at the base of the petals, and then we have some kind of burgundy with an orange. So a wide range of colors. Oftentimes they have flecks. Those flecks help lead pollinators down into where they need to get. And these plants do multiply quickly. So this is more like a traditional perennial that you would have in your garden, where you plant a bulb, that bulb multiplies. You know, at some point you might need to actually divide them, and that means you just dig up the whole thing, divide them out, and share with friends or plant in other spaces. There is no fragrance with the Asiatic lilies. So if that is something that you love with some of the other types, especially the Easter lilies, just know that this does not have a fragrance. A couple cultivars that are really common and again easy to grow. Connecticut King is a very, very beautiful yellow, and then we have Crete, which is a dark pink. You can see that they're both about 3 to 4 feet tall. Blooming will start in June, maybe into July. It might be a little bit sooner in your gardens in Oregon, so maybe early June to mid-June. But just know that these are two very common cultivars, very hardy, easy to grow, kind of a no-brainer if you're getting into the lily growing craze. Oriental lilies are the ones that are heavily scented. These are also very, very showy. They're going to bloom after the Asiatic lilies. So just know that the Asiatics bloom first, then followed by the Oriental lilies. So if the Asiatics are blooming in June, early July, these would start generally July through August. They will do best if they are having morning sun, but then are protected from the hot afternoon sun and strong winds. They're not quite as sturdy as the Asiatic lilies. So just keep that in mind, that they're kind of wimpy, they might break, but they are heavily scented, and of course they're a showstopper. Really, really beautiful. The one, of course, that I think we're most familiar with is Stargazer. It's a very interesting story. The man actually who bred this was a professor at Iowa State. If you've ever read the book Flower Confidential, it's a fun read about the cut flower industry, which is kind of a cutthroat industry, but it's a great read. Again, it's called Flower Confidential, and Stargazer has really an amazing story. It was the life work of this very unique gentleman. But it's a darker pink compared to Black Beauty. And again, those petals are a little bit reflexed. So they kind of go out as opposed to staying nice and tight. When you do bring them inside as cut flowers, it's always a good idea to remove those anthers, because they stain clothes and they get all over and they drop and they shed pollen. They're just not a good thing. So you can just remove those with a tissue. Turk's cap is our final lily. These are smaller and they're very reflex. So those petals almost bend entirely backwards. They're really, really striking. They're just unique looking in the landscape. So again, more of the colors, they're not quite the pinks, they're more yellow, orange, burgundy, white. But again, these are plants. So my husband's grandma also grew Turk's cap lilies, and she had her section of dahlias. She had her section of Turk's cap lilies, and then entered both in local contests. These are larger plants. They can get up to 7 feet tall if conditions are right. So they do make a statement, but just know that the flowers are a little bit smaller and they're going to bloom a little bit earlier in the summer. And our next plant is gladiolus or gladiola, however you want to say it. What I love about gladiola is that the colors of gladiola are incredible. There's a true green, so I'm featuring green star. I love that we have a green flowered plant. These are those spiky plants that you'll see, and they're very, very common. It's kind of a funeral plant, if you will. You often see them in casket sprays and things like that, but they're very much an old-fashioned plant. So there was a gentleman who my mom knew, Pete Transberg, Pete and Inez. They had a beautiful garden down in Minnesota, and he would grow gladiolus every year. And there were times that we would get to visit, and he would have his gladiolus planted in rows, and they were absolutely beautiful. And this is the plant that you would want to succession sow. So every couple of weeks, plant a few more corms so that you have a beautiful line of gladiolus for many, many weeks. The corms only need to be about 3 inches deep and 6 inches apart, which is nice. So it's not a deep dig. Saves your back. And again, because these plants are tall, the plants themselves can get to be about maybe 2 to 3 feet tall, and they're very spiky. It's a great one for the back of a border. So if you do need a little bit of height, that would be a great thing. One year I planted them against the fence. I had limited success primarily because I do not water. It's my own fault. It's nothing else. But I wasn't consistent with the moisture. But the ones that did bloom were absolutely wonderful. And then when you harvest gladiolus, they'll start to bloom from the bottom up. So they'll bloom up the spike. So when you have the first 2 flowers on the bottom emerge and they're full, that's when you would then make the cut and bring them indoors, because the flowers will continue to bloom up the spike, and they last a long time as a cut flower, at least 7 to 10 days, if not longer, if you're cutting them regularly and then changing the water. Oops. You can also do gladiolus in a container. Because the bulbs, the corms are nice and small, you can generally fit a few into a container, but again, make sure that it's deep and wide enough. And you'll plant them 4 to 6 inches deep and 2 inches apart, just slightly deeper in a container than you would in a garden bed. And again, succession sow, so you get those extra blooms. And you don't have to cut any of these plants as cut flowers. You can always leave them in the garden. So you can let them go until the foliage and the flowers brown. Caladiums are amazing. This is a foliage plant, and if you haven't become familiar with caladiums, I would encourage you to give these a try. They are incredibly tropical. They kind of are reminiscent of elephant ears, so if you're growing that as a houseplant, caladiums kind of fit that bill. I did a summer internship in Georgia, and the property used caladiums all over, and it was incredible. Really beautiful plants. And what's nice is that these are the one that really do best in the shade. And so if you have kind of a dark area in your landscape and it needs a little bit of brightening up, caladiums would be a perfect choice to put in that spot. There are 2 types of caladiums, the fancy leaf and then the lance leaf. So fancy leaf caladiums, these are very large. The foliage itself is much, much larger. And what's really interesting is that these leaves have very long petioles. Petiole is just the stem of the leaf. So the petiole actually arises from the base and then the leaf unfurls. So the petioles can be up to 30 inches long, and then you have this really enormous leaf. And so it's almost this really massive statement. These are great container plants because they would serve as your thriller, the plant that's like, wow, look at that, that's amazing. So, but just know that the leaf itself can be very, very large. The lance leaf caladiums, they're smaller, the petioles are shorter, and these are more compact. And so if you don't have room in the landscape for an enormous plant with even bigger leaves, the lance leaf caladium might be a better choice for you. The edges of the leaf might be a little bit ruffled, which is really pretty fun. So they add a little bit of that, and they really add a nice texture. So if you're looking to add texture to the garden, I always encourage people to take a black and white picture of their garden and then look to see, is everything kind of the same shape and size, or is there anything where you might need a little bit of different structure? Caladiums can add a little bit of different structure just because of the leaf. For caladiums, these are corms, just like our friend the gladiolus, and they only need to be planted a couple inches deep. You can actually start them indoors, so you could do that now, or because you're in Oregon, you could probably plant them outside right now. And the trick, plant them pointy side up. Pretty easy. You can also purchase potted plants. So a lot of the garden centers have these in their shade garden section. So you could plant those. And then do keep them inside and protected until it's warm enough to move them outside. So that would really depend, again, on the type of spring that you have. And there was a question if deer eat caladiums. I don't deal with deer, and so I don't know an answer to that question. I feel like deer and rabbits, they'll try everything if they are hungry enough. And so if anyone has any information, please type that into the chat. Miss Patty is wondering if deer eat caladiums. A couple of different varieties for you to consider. Rosebud, white Christmas, that would be absolutely beautiful in a more shaded garden. Pair it with white, you could have more of a night garden look, but just know the diversity in the veins and the variegation among the caladiums is wonderful. And I do want to just call attention briefly to crocosmia. This is one that you may or may not be familiar with. It's marginally hardy here in Colorado, but it would do great in your gardens in Oregon. And again, these are corms. So these are plants that you can either buy in pots already started for you, or you can buy the corms and add them to your garden. They are great for hummingbirds. They love those flowers because they're more tubular and their little beaks can get in there. And they're a nice one because they bloom a little bit later into the summer. And they're an awesome cut flower. They can last a really long time. So you would plant your crocosmia outside when you plant your dahlias. They can take a little bit more shade too. So unlike the dahlias and some of the others, these would be more friends with your caladiums in the shaded part of the garden. Space your corms 6 to 8 inches apart, 3 to 5 inches deep, and then group them together for maximum impact. So a lot like how you're going to plant the lilies. So group them together in plants of 5 to 7, and then you will get basically 1 bloom per plant, which is really nice. So that's why you want to plant more of them. A couple to consider, lucifer. Just love that name because it's just a perfect name for that color of the flower. They do get to be about 4 to 5 feet tall, and the flowers of this are a brilliant scarlet, and they're just absolutely, again, packed with nectar. So they're a perfect plant for hummingbirds. Another one is carmine brilliant. That could be one that you could consider. It's a little bit smaller than lucifer, only about 30 inches tall as opposed to 48 inches tall. But carmine brilliant is another one. And again, this is why you want to plant en masse, because you do want that impact of a lot of those flowers. And ember glow is kind of between the two. So ember glow has more of a bicolor with a little bit of a yellow throat, and then that brilliant red foliage. And these are zone 5, so these would survive easily in your McMinnville gardens. And just to wrap up, before we talk about overwintering and what you can do with these plants after they have bloomed, let's just briefly discuss tuberous begonias. They are so beautiful. And again, this is another one that does really well in the shade. So this is great to plant under trees, or maybe if you only get a little bit of morning sun but afternoon shade, your tuberous begonias are going to be a great choice. Many, many, many different colors, a lot of bicolors. And what I love about the tuberous begonias is that they almost mimic roses in some cases. So or a carnation, actually, this is what that looks like to me. So just know that there's a lot of diversity in the flower color, the flower type, what it looks like, and there's also a lot of diversity in the foliage color as well. So just be aware that the tuberous begonia market, there seems to be a lot of breeding going into it, and amazing things are coming out. So you can purchase tuberous begonias as starts. So these would be available just like your other annuals are in the garden centers in the spring. Or if you want to plant something specific, or you want to give it a try because you're challenging yourself to something new, you can also buy the tubers. So the tubers are weird. They look like little clods of soil. They're not much to look at. But what you can do is actually start these indoors. And so if you're doing any sort of seed starting, you can also start your tuberous begonias about the same time. If you start them in February indoors, you'll get blooms in June. If you start them a little bit later, you can get July blooms. So you could, again, almost succession sow your tuberous begonias to get a longer bloom period. You'll plant them in peat moss or vermiculite, and on the top of each tuber is a little shallow dip. You'll plant that facing up. So make sure that that little shallow dip is planting upright. And then you'll plant them and just barely cover them with, again, peat moss or the vermiculite. Whatever the planting medium you're using to start these, just very shallowly cover them. And then indoors, you'll really want to watch your water, because these are plants, because of the nature of how they grow, they're very susceptible to root rot. So just be very careful with your watering. As soon as you start to see growth is when you can actually transplant them to either other containers, or if it's warm enough, you could transplant them outside after you harden them off. They can get kind of leggy, so that's where a grow light or other lights will be helpful in keeping them short and squat. Okay, so let's talk, to end the class, about storing these plants and what you can do. And again, because I am more used to cold weather and not Oregon conditions, if I say anything out of line, please by all means correct me. I would love to hear your feedback. I did a lot of research online to make sure that I think I have the right information. But again, I'm more proficient at talking how to grow these as opposed to how to store them. So when you store your dahlias, again, they are tubers, and there's kind of two trains of thought. One is people just let them overwinter in their garden with no problems. Digging them up can cause some stress to the plants every year, but then there are others who always dig them up because of your rainy, wet winters. And rainy, wet winters, of course, lead to cold soils. It can lead to poor drainage, and so sometimes these plants can get a little bit susceptible to root rot. But what you do is, once you have a frost, you can let the frost basically touch the plants and then let them die down naturally. So again, if your plants are in an ideal, well-drained location, you can probably leave them through the winter. Now, if you have a crazy winter with really cold temperatures, just know that you might have some damage to those plants. And so if there are cultivars or varieties that are really special to you, I would recommend that you dig them up. After you dig them, you can brush the soil off and then make sure that you let them cure. And what curing does is it kind of allows the bulb to dry down. You don't want to go from garden to storage, because a lot of the soil, a lot of that moisture can then impact the storage life of the tuber. So curing can be done in a number of ways. One is you can take some mesh screens or some hardware cloth, or whatever you have. If you have window screens, those would work too. Just keep them out of the sun. So essentially, you're going to put the bulbs, the tubers, on this mesh screen, let them dry down, and really it depends how long you do it based on the type of bulb. So this is where I would encourage you, depending on what you're growing, to do a little bit of extra research. If you don't have screens, you can put them on newspaper. You just really want to keep them off a porous surface. So on a garage floor or something, sometimes those can absorb moisture. So you do just want to keep them slightly elevated so there's better air circulation. General storage tips, if you are going to keep these over the winter indoors, is pack them loosely. It can be in shredded paper. It can be in peat moss, vermiculite. If you have wood shavings available, any of those things are going to work. You're going to pack them nice and loose, and don't pack too many together in a location. If you have a lot, you can use cardboard. That's totally fine. Just again, making sure that the materials are nice and loose and that there's plenty of breathing room for those tubers during the winter months. Don't use anything like a plastic storage bin with the lid closed. You again want that air circulation. And then also ensure that the bulbs are not touching each other, because if one starts to decay, then it's like the berries in your fridge, then everything starts to decay. So again, make sure that they have plenty of space. And Patty messaged me that what she does with her dahlias, thank you, Patty, is she fills a black pot with compost. She cuts the dahlia stalks at an angle close to the ground and then turns that black pot upside down to divert the water away. That's a great idea, Patty. So she's leaving them in the garden, but to ensure that the plants aren't getting too wet, she just covers them with a black pot. That is brilliant and so much easier than having to dig them up, because if you've ever done that, it's not that much fun. It's true. Moving on to overwintering your cannas, your gladiolas, and your lilies. For the most part, these are going to be hardy, and you can leave them in the garden. Yay! So that might be a bonus to overwintering these plants. At least they should be hardy if you have a normal winter. I'm not sure what normal means anymore anywhere across the United States, but just know that these are generally tolerant of your winter temperatures. One thing that you can do is if they do need to be divided, you can dig them up in the spring. So that means digging up the entire clump of plants and then whacking them apart, replanting a portion where it was, and then you can either share with friends or plant them in other parts of the garden. If you do want to ensure that extra winter protection, you may consider adding some wood mulch or grass clippings or leaves or something on top of those plants, just to help moderate some of those freeze-thaw temperatures that you might get in the winter months. With caladiums, it's going to depend on what kind of winter you have. They probably will survive, maybe, if it's a really mild winter. If you have any concerns or you're just not sure, you really love the plant that you grew, then I would dig them up. And again, allow them to cure in a warm spot for about a week. So again, you'll dig them up, brush any soil off on the corm itself, and then allow them to cure for about a week, and then you can store them in that cardboard box accordingly. If you do want to leave them in the garden, cut the foliage back after it turns yellow. This is generally at the end of the season. Maybe you've had a light frost. And if you do store them, just know that caladiums need to be stored slightly warmer than other bulbs, so about 60 degrees. I know you don't have basements, but if you have a spot in the garage, or maybe you have a crawl space, maybe you have a root cellar, I don't know, whatever you have, but just know that they might need to be stored just a little bit warmer than some of the other bulbs. Your tuberous begonias, you will want to dig. These are ones that are not likely to survive. It's not even warm enough in Oregon to have tuberous begonia survive. So dig before a hard frost. And a hard frost is 28. I know you don't usually get too many hard frosts, but just know that that is the threshold. So you'll want to dig them up before it gets too cold. And like our others, let them dry for a couple weeks. You can leave a little bit of the foliage still on the corm or the tuber. You can leave that on there and then cut it back once you're ready to store them fully. Remove the excess soil, and ideal storage temperature is around 50 degrees. So final tips before we leave and enjoy our corned beef later today. If it's too much work to do all of this, you can absolutely treat these plants as annuals. You know, what grows, grows, what survives, survives. Hey, that's all right. Just know that it's a little bit of an expensive investment. It's not going to be nearly as cheap as maybe a 6-pack of petunias, but it really will give your garden a little bit more diversity than maybe you've had. I would recommend Lily of the Nile. This is Agapanthus, the one featured. I love it because it's one of the few blue flowers that we actually have, and that's another type of bulb that you could consider planting. It's a wonderful container plant. So consider that one too. And just remember that anytime you can buy in bulk, it's usually cheaper. So get together with your garden or seroptimist friends and maybe put in a bulk order for some things. And again, don't be afraid to try new things. See how it works, see what you have success with, and then you can share at your upcoming meetings. A final disclaimer is that you can support your local McMinnville seroptimist by shopping at Brent and Becky's Bulbs. This is an online bulb company located on the East Coast. And again, I bought some bulbs from them last year. They were super high quality. I was really impressed. Their customer service was incredible. And they have a great selection of summer blooming bulbs that you could purchase. So If you click on the Bloomin' Bucks program and select Seroptimus International of McMinnville, your local Seroptimus can get 25% donated back to their club from your order. And of course, the Seroptimus do so many great things with scholarships and supporting women in your community that this is a really easy thing to do and a way that you can support local and get something new in your life for your garden. So again, it's the Bloomin' Bucks program through Brent and Becky's, and all you have to do is select Seroptimus International of McMinnville, and again, 25% of your order will be donated back to the club, which is wonderful. Oops. So with that, I will say happy planting to you. Again, hit up your local Oregon State University Extension office in Yamhill County for more information. This is Maple the Beagle. I had planted some dahlias. I had to do something because the container didn't look great, so I threw in some pansies. But Maple the Beagle and I both thank you for your attention today, and I will take any questions you have in the chat. And Patty and Jan, if you want to come back on as final parting words, I'd welcome you to do that as well.
Well, I would love to say that just another thank you, Alison. This has been so wonderful, and I've been taking notes. And so it's nice to know, though, that you're going to send that out, and I can refer back. It's also nice to know that mid-April will be a time for planting out here. I was afraid I had missed it. So I appreciate your efforts here and enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Patty?
I can't get it to work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I want to thank you again for a fabulous program, and I look forward to spending some money today online. You're great. I love the Seroptimus, and Garden Club members, remember I have a whole bunch of dahlia bulbs that were given to us. Talk to you later.
That's great, Patty. And I saw there's a couple questions in the chat, and also my colleague Tony was on, and he texted in that caladiums are often listed as deer resistant. So if you do have deer issues, I know my mom does, maybe try some caladiums. You can read what he said. Deer don't pay much attention to the internet, however, and while many people claim that deer love their caladiums, others list them as deer resistant. On the other hand, gladiolus appear to be much less bothered by deer and are listed on other university sites as deer resistant. So there you go. Maybe not caladiums, but maybe more gladiolus. And then Linda, your question, let me scroll up, was your dahlias rarely last more than a day inside. Any suggestions? So I would say with all of our cut flowers, make sure that you're cutting during a cool part of the day. So that would be either early in the morning or late in the evening. And then as soon as you cut, make sure that you're immediately putting those stems into water so that they have water to absorb. Even just cutting them and then walking to the house can actually cause them to senesce more quickly or die back more quickly. Using a floral preserve does work as well. So these are plants that do need regular water. They need clean water. Make sure that the water is more room temperature, and then add that floral preserve and then do a fresh cut. But that should get you some great extension. But cutting in the morning and immediately putting them in a bucket of water should get you a longer bloom period. And then Wendy and Pearl had a comment that using a bulb auger, you can attach that to the end of your drill. That will help you dig your holes. Could not agree more. We have some of the worst clay soils that are impossible to dig in. So any tool that can help you work your soil better is going to be of benefit. Yeah, and I think I got all the other questions. So again, my email address is there. Feel free to contact me. Thank you again for this opportunity, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.